If you're learning Swedish, then you don't want to wait having a conversation until you have studied the entire 500-page grammar book. On the other hand, if you make grammar mistakes, people might misunderstand you, or you might sound very weird at least, so you want to avoid that. So what to do? In this video, I'm going to introduce a concept that might help you a bit to navigate the complications of the grammar. I'm using a traffic light system because I believe there is something like red grammar, yellow grammar, and green grammar. What does that mean? Red grammar are the grammar items that you should absolutely know actively, because if you get them wrong, people in Sweden will not understand you, or at least you're going to sound very odd. The yellow grammar is more like the, well, nice to have. If you get it right, good. If you don't get it right, you might sound a little bit clumsy, but it's not a big deal. People will most likely still understand what you want to say. And the green grammar is really mostly for the aesthetics. So if you're getting really, really good and you want to sound as natural as possible, then you might want to know the green grammar items actively as well, but otherwise it's not that important. If you make a mistake with them, people might not even notice at first glance. Of course, it doesn't mean you should ignore the yellow and the green grammar completely, but you should take it more as an illustration. We're going to get back to that. Anyway, you should know the red grammar items really well, and that's why I'm going to show you all of them in this video. Fortunately, there are only 8 of them in the Swedish language, so that's really great. So in the next 20-25 minutes, you're going to significantly upgrade your grammar in Swedish. Let's dive right in. The first thing I'd like to show you are verbs and pronouns. Verbs are all the words that explain to us what somebody is doing, like to sing, to cook, to love, to live. These are verbs. And pronouns are the words that tell us who is doing something. I, you, he, she, it, and so on. And of course, we have these pronouns in Swedish as well. There are jag, du, han, hon, den, det, vi, ni, and dom. You might notice that the pronunciation is very weird sometimes, especially for this last one, where the writing is completely different from the way we pronounce it, but okay, that's just to be accepted and to be learned. Notice also that we have 2 translations for the English you. So we have du when we're addressing one person, and we have ni when we're addressing 2 or several persons. So you have to make that distinction in Swedish. Also, we have 2 translations for the English it. We have den and we have der, and I'm going to explain to you in a minute why that is the case. But anyway, what is really cool about Swedish is that whatever pronoun we use when we combine it with a verb, the verb will always have the same ending. So for example, jag tittar, but also vi tittar, dom tittar, and so on. It's always the same ending. I'm talking about present tense here, so things that are happening right now. And when we're talking about this, then we usually have an R ending. You can see all the verbs here have an R ending. It's not always, but most of the time. Now, you might say, what's so special about the fact that the verb never changes? Well, just look at English. We would say I work, but she works. You can't say I works or she work. It would be wrong, and it would sound very odd. But in Swedish, we don't make that distinction. So that's really, really cool. Also, in Swedish, we don't have a difference between I work and I am working. We would use the same form of the verb, and you have to get out of the context whether that is something that is happening right now or whether that is something that happens regularly. Now, let's go back to this problem about den and der. Why do we have 2 different forms for it? Well, that's because in Swedish, objects, things, have a gender. That's very odd, but that's just a reality of the Swedish language. And depending on what gender an object has, you have to pick either den for the so-called common gender things, and you have to pick der for the neuter gender things. Now, how do you know? Well, you have to learn it by heart, and that is definitely not red grammar. That is way more or way less relevant, actually. So therefore, if you pick the wrong one, then that's not a big deal either. And by the way, if you want to learn Swedish systematically from scratch all the way to fluency, and you're tired of the boring textbooks, apps, and so on, what is out there, then I'd like to invite you to check out my story-based course, which is called Alfred the Ghost. It's based on a story about a ghost, as you can guess, and it starts super, super simply. With every chapter, though, the story gets a little bit more complicated, and if you want to know how the story ends, then you have to keep learning Swedish. With every chapter, of course, you get vocabulary lists, you get grammar explanations that go really deep into the grammar of the Swedish language, you get pronunciation exercises, interactive exercises for listening comprehension, and so on. So there's a ton of material for you there. It can really be the basis of all your Swedish learning. Check out the link in the description, but now let's continue to work on our Swedish red grammar. The next item on my list are pronouns again. And now we're making a distinction between subjects and objects. What does that mean? So in a sentence, I can either be the person who is doing something, then I'm the subject, or I can be the somehow, victim of the action that's being performed, and then I'm the object. Now, you might say when somebody likes someone else, you're not really the victim, but depends whether you want to be liked or not. So you get the idea of the grammatical concept of an object, I guess. And we make a distinction here. We do that also in English. We would say he likes her. We don't say he likes she. And we would say she likes him. We don't say she likes he, right? So we change these words, he to him and she to her. And we do something similar in Swedish, and you have a whole list of the forms here. So for every subject form of a pronoun, we also have an object form, and you have to learn these by heart, unfortunately, as usual. But fortunately, there are not many forms, and you can see that some pronouns also don't change. And for other pronouns, it's not really that complicated. You see that some pronouns have this alternative form, say. What do we use it for? Well, we use it when the subject and the object are the same person. How does that work? Well, for example, when somebody looks at himself in the mirror, or when somebody washes himself, or when somebody reminds himself or something, then we would use this say. And when subject and object are two different people, then we would use the other form like honom, or as you saw here, henne or them. Notice also now that with the object forms, in total, we have 4 translations for the English use. So that's a little bit odd, but again, that's just the reality of the Swedish language. We have one form to address one person, another form to address 2 people. And when we talk about objects, then we have yet another form for one person and a 4th form for 2 persons. So you can see here, a little bit confusing for English speakers, but of course it makes talking in Swedish a very precise thing. The next thing I'd like to show you is asking questions, and that's considerably easier than in English, because in Swedish we don't do something like do you want to or don't you like and so on. All we do is to make a distinction between open questions, which we have here, and yes no questions, which we have here. Yes no questions are called yes no questions because you can only answer either yes or no, and they start with a verb in Swedish. Very simple. We put the verb first and then the entire rest of the sentence. Kan du ställa det på bordet? Ligger den på bordet? Yeah, very easy. And then you can answer with yes, which is ja, or maybe ja visst. Or we can answer with no, which is nej. Very simple. And then we have the open questions, and they start with the question words. Question words are like where, why, how, who, and so on. And we just put the question word first, and then we put the rest of the sentence. Var vill du ha kistan? Very simple as well. You should know numbers by heart. You might argue that numbers are not really grammar, and in a way that's true. But on the other hand, numbers are so important that I wanted to include them here in my list, because you encounter them everywhere when you're talking about time, when you're talking about prices, bus lines, hotel rooms, quantities. Everything has numbers. So you should know them, you should learn them by heart. Just try to count in Swedish, first slowly and then faster and faster. Whenever you stumble, look back at the list again and start again from 0 until it becomes second nature for you to count in Swedish. It's not that difficult, I would say. So just take a little bit of time to get really fluent in numbers. That will actually help you a lot. Let's talk about possessive pronouns. As the name says, possessive pronouns are about owning things, or even about owning people. Now, in real life, we don't own people anymore, but in grammar, we can still do that. You can say something like my sister, her brother-in-law. Well, it's not really your sister. You don't own your sister, but you understand the concept. So, of course, we have these words, my, your, his, and so on in Swedish as well. And they're min, din, hans, hennes, vår, er, deras. Quite simple. Why do I have these alternative forms here always for jag, du, vi, and ni? Well, it's the usual issue about grammar again, that we have genders in Swedish. So we have to make a distinction between the genders of the object we're owning. So if you're owning a box, then the box is common gender and you have to say min. If you're owning a table, then the table is neutral gender and you have to say mitt. Yeah, you have to say min kista, mitt bord. And in the plural, when we're talking about several objects, you would say mina, like mina nycklor, mina kistor, mina bord. Here the gender is not relevant anymore. It's always mina. Yeah, you can say mina nycklar, mina kistor, mina bord. It doesn't make a difference that these are different gender words. Just when it's plural, then we have this a ending. Again, of course, picking the right one is not red grammar. So if you make a mistake, if you say mitt kista, min bord, people will understand what you want to say. That's a minor mistake. That's one I allow you to make, to put it that way. It's not a big deal, but you should know the concept in general. And of course, you should definitely know all the basic forms of these pronouns, because that's really important. You want to be able to say precisely who owns something. When you're talking about things in the plural, then unfortunately that's a little bit more complicated than in English. In English, we just add an S, like you have one car or you have two cars, you have one bike or you have two bikes, you have one cup or you have 5 cups. But unfortunately, in Swedish, the nouns have different endings. The ending could be or al, or ed, or en, or no ending at all, and you have to know which noun has which ending. But I would say that knowing which ending is the correct one is not a red grammar item. Just knowing that these forms exist and that you should pick the one that you assume is most likely, that's what you should do. You don't necessarily have to remember exactly what is the right form for each noun, at least not at the beginning. I will get back to that in a minute. If you want to tell somebody what happened last week or last month or earlier in your life, you will need a past tense form. There are 3 past tense forms in Swedish, but I'm going to show you only one here because that's sufficient. I'm going to show you the one that is called preteritum. In English, we would call that simple past. Why simple? Well, because every verb has just one form. You don't need to combine it with anything else. And the cool thing in Swedish, again, is that for each pronoun, we have the same form. So it's not like in French where it makes a big difference whether you did something or they did something or she did something. No, in Swedish, always the same. Yeah, jag gick, vi gick, de gick. You can see always the same. Now, how do you know that form? Well, that's the problem. If the verb is irregular, and unfortunately there is a number of irregular verbs in Swedish, then you cannot really know it. You have to learn it by heart. And if you want to have a list of the most important verbs, everything I'm teaching you here in this video is downloadable as a PDF, and I'd like to invite you to download this PDF form of the Survival Guide to Basic Swedish Grammar. There is a link in the video description as usual. You can save it to your computer and you can study all the past tense forms of the irregular verbs. If the verb is regular, though, then it's a little bit easier because then it belongs to one of 3 groups. And you can see by the ending, well, they're actually very similar. So again, if you pick the wrong one, people will most likely still understand what you want to say. So this is how it works. You have the basic form of the verb, the infinitive, the one that you would find in the dictionary without any specific ending. And then you have the present tense form with the usual R ending. Well, and then what happens, like for these R verbs, you get this de ending here. And for the verbs, you get the te ending. And for the ones that just end in an R, like these short verbs with a vowel, a single vowel like boo, you get the double D, and the double D is of course only to make this U here short. So you don't say ja bude, it becomes short actually. How do you know whether it's the first or the second group? That's a little bit tricky. Most verbs go into that group, into the first one. The ones that go into the second group are the ones that have an AR ending in the present tense. Well, of course you have to know that. And then they also have a hard consonant here, so an F or a K or P, S, T, X. So these verbs, they get a te ending in the past tense. But again, you can see, like if you say something like jag tänkte with a soft D, it sounds almost the same. People will understand, but you need to know the basic concept of how the past tense is formed in Swedish. And now for the last item on my grammar list, that's comparing. If you want to say that something is bigger, nicer, sweeter, and so on, then you need a form that's called comparative, and it's also very easy in Swedish. You just add this are, ja, det kallare än I Stockholm, colder than in Stockholm. Yeah, you can see the are ending on the adjective, and you have this n, which is the same as in English, then colder than in Stockholm, and that's it. Now we have a number of adjectives that, just like in English, don't get an ending, but they do it like with more, like more interesting. And in Swedish we would say mer spännande. And these are the adjectives usually that either are not originally Swedish, or they are derived from a verb, or they end in an sk. Well, how do you know that? Whether it's derived from a verb, for example, that can be a little bit tricky. Again, here, of course, if you make a mistake and you pick this system instead of that system, if you say something like mer kall, people will understand what you want to say, so it's not a big deal. But in the long run, of course, you want to know which adjectives this concerns. But again, as I said, this is not red grammar. When you're talking about the record holder of something, then we use the superlative, like the biggest, the nicest, the coldest, yeah. And you can see the adjectives that get an ending, they get an ost ending here. So kallare becomes kallast, which is like coldest. Mer becomes mest, just like in English, more and most. Yeah, you can see the relationship between the languages here. So instead of mer spännande, we would say mest spännande. And that's it, except for the fact that, as usual, we have a couple of irregular adjectives, and you have to learn how they compare. This list is again on the PDF that I'm publishing with this video, so feel free to download it. The link is in the video description. And you can see, fortunately, very often the irregularity is not so big, so sometimes it's just another vowel. We say större instead of stor, or längre after long, so it's not very difficult. Sometimes it's really difficult and you have to know, like gammal becomes äldre, liten becomes mindre. You have to know that by heart, otherwise there's no chance of you getting it right. So that much for the red grammar. That's it, basically. These are the essential things that you have to learn actively in the Swedish grammar. And you might wonder, well, what about the yellow grammar and the green grammar? Should I just ignore it? My advice is no, that's not how I want to say it, or how I want it to be understood. The distinction should be in your head. The red grammar is something that you know actively. The yellow grammar and the green grammar is something you will still study, but you don't care so much whether you get it wrong or right. And let me give you an example. The plural form of nouns, for example. I told you it's a bit tricky, and it's almost unavoidable that you're going to make mistakes with it, because there are so many different forms and you might just pick the wrong one. Not a big deal, because people will still understand you. But in the long run, of course, you will want to get it right most of the time. So how can you do that if you don't study the plural form of nouns from early on in your Swedish language learning journey? Same with genders. Every noun has a gender and you have to learn it, and there's no sense in the distribution really, so you have to learn it with every noun. Of course, you're going to make mistakes with it. It's not a big deal, but in the long run, when you know maybe hundreds or maybe even 1,000 nouns in Swedish, you want to get 90, 95, 98% of the genders right. So you have to study that from the beginning, but relax a little bit about the expectation of getting it right when it comes to yellow or green grammar. And also you should take the yellow and green grammar as an illustration of something that shows you how the language functions, because that's really important for you, also for your confidence of mastering this project of learning the Swedish language. It's like a car mechanic. A car mechanic knows that to fix the engine, there is this certain screw that they have to open or tighten or whatever. They might not know where exactly with this specific car the screw can be found. They might have to look that up in the manual, but they know that this is the general issue. So that's about the attitude you should have to the yellow and green grammar. You want to know how the Swedish language functions. But if you manage to apply this actively from the beginning, no, that's not realistic. Be kind to yourself, allow yourself to make mistakes, but focus more on the red grammar. And basically, what is even much more important than the grammar and neglected by most language schools, most apps, is the pronunciation. So that is something where you're really going to produce misunderstandings, something that's really going to hold you back. So therefore, I'd like to invite you to check out the pronunciation videos on this channel.